Hello everyone and welcome back to another Wizard101 video. Today, I'm doing something a bit different than the last few days and the last very long time on my channel, and that is a lore video. Now, I haven't done one of these in a very long time. Usually, I kind of stay away from lore because it requires a bit of research and takes a long time, but today, I kind of wanted to do kind of a twofer. First, I want to go over some of the lore of Arc 4 because it's really interesting, but I feel like not a lot of people have paid attention to it, and not a lot of people actually know the overarching lore. So I hope to be a little bit of a help there in kind of figuring out the overarching plot. Second, I want to kind of predict what I think Arc 4 will look like, because Arc 4 isn't done, and I don't even think it's close to done. I've predicted in the past, and I'm still standing by it. I think that this arc isn't going to have 3 worlds, and I don't think it's going to have 5. I think it's going to have a nice solid 4 worlds, which is going to be interesting, because it's different than any other arc in the past. Usually, in the past, arcs, are 3 or 5. I think this one is going to be somewhere in the middle at 4. I don't think it's going to be 3, definitely. So we'll have to see. But today I wanted to kind of go over that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, first I'd like to preface this by saying, in every arc, there's 2 main plots. Obviously, there is the plot of the world, so there is specifically what's happening in that world, and then there's the overarching plot. Now, the overarching plot is related to what's happening in those worlds, but it's not directly what's happening. It's usually either a spark or just something that's going on in the background. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I want to go over the overarching plot of Arc 4, because I feel like it's actually very interesting, but not a lot of people have paid attention to it. It's kind of something that's been like subtly in the background the whole time that hasn't really been pushed forward and pushed as hard as, say, Morganth's plotline has, or Malastaire's plotline, or even Grandfather Spider's. This has kind of been a more subtle approach. So let's get into the overarching plot. Now, the first thing to note, and the very first thing that hints at this overarching plot, is actually at the end of Imperia. If you remember, we finish Imperia, we beat up the Aether Titan, all that, and we come here back to the Arcanum, and Sybil the Knowledge Tree says a very interesting line. I believe this goes something along the lines of, "All you have to fear now is nothing." Nothing is in white letters, and it is capitalized, which means, again, it's a proper noun. I don't need to teach you that. You've been in school before, I'm sure. But basically, nothing isn't being used as a regular word. It's being used as a proper noun. Nothing is a being of sorts. Now, this is important because the nothing is actually the main character in this overarching plotline, and I feel like not a lot of people really recognize this. So what is the nothing? Where do they come from, and where do they participate in the story? So the nothing is a sort of mass. It's not really a person, a specific being. It's just there. It's outside of the spiral, outside of the main everything, in quotes, and it sort of is just vibing there. Now, this nothing actually gains interest in the wizard, and they gain interest in us because we are very unique. We are unique in the fact that we contain both of the contradictory magics in this game. There is light magic, which is basic magic, and shadow magic, which, again, is the darker magic. This theoretically shouldn't be possible because shadow magic is supposed to corrupt, it's supposed to be very dangerous, very powerful, and you can see multiple times that we are special in that regard. At the end of Chrysalis, we gain the Child of Light and Shadow badge, kind of in regards to that. Further on, once we actually beat Imperia, we gain the Divine Paradox badge, because we're past a normal person, we are kind of divine, but we are a paradox because, again, the light and shadow. This gains the interest of the nothing. The nothing is interested in how this paradoxical being could possibly exist, so they want to try to talk to us. They do this in a few ways. The first way, and this is sparked in Caramel, is, you may remember, the old one is trying to initiate peace talks between the Cabal and the Arcanum. He is doing this with the express purpose to get into his office to get the world synthesizer, but we don't know that. Obviously, we just see that he wants peace, so we go to, shake his hand, declare peace between us, and he is kidnapped by a kind of cavity thing. He falls into it, and these cavities show up all throughout Caramel. Well, what I didn't understand at the time, and I feel like is a little bit harder to understand kind of if you're not actually looking into it, is the fact that these cavities and these black holes are done by the nothing. The nothing is very intent on discussing with us, the wizard, how we can be this paradoxical being, and it's trying to gain our attention to try to talk with us. So it kidnaps the old one, and it continues obviously does things with these cavities to try to gain our attention. Well, fast forward a little bit to the end of Caramel, we find out that, you know, Nana's been kidnapped, all this stuff, and we go into this kind of weird realm thing, and we see what's called the aberrant paradox. Now, what the aberrant paradox is, the aberrant paradox is the nothing taking on our form to try to communicate with us. It's, again, trying to understand who we are as people. Now, obviously, this comes to blows. We, you know, have to fight the aberrant paradox to try to save the old one and Nana, all that. We defeat them, and they go back. The old one is seemingly missing, and we don't know why or where, but we save Nana, and that's kind of the end of this world. We don't know exactly what happened with the old one, all that. There's a few questions left to be raised. Well, this is continued with Lemuria. The old one shows up, and he seems to be rather confused, speaking in, you know, confusing speech, stuttering speech. As we go on and we discover more, we discover that people can't actually see him. He's just there, and it seems like he's almost a figment of our imagination. We don't really get it. Well, it turns out that this old one is actually the nothing. The nothing has absorbed the old one as a whole and became that. The nothing is now in a kind of physical form that only we can see, and they are now experiencing the spiral as is. They have kept some of the ambitions of the old one, like the old one wanted to get into his office and gain the world synthesizer to save Lemuria. The nothing retains this goal. They really want to save Lemuria, but as time goes on, they become more and more attached to the spiral and the wizard as a whole. The nothing and the old one becomes Design. Design is one of the main kind of protagonist supporting roles in Lemuria, as I'm sure a lot of people know. Design's a really cool character. I'm sure a lot of people love him, and he really wants to help us save Lemuria, save the world. We eventually get to the end of Lemuria, and the world synthesizer is about to go off and kind of, you know, jeopardize everything, and Design sacrifices himself by kind of fusing with the world synthesizer and just disappearing. We go back to the Arcanum, and we see a little floating thing outside, which is supposedly Design. So that's what we know so far. We know about the nothing's intentions, and what he is. He is a good being who's learned from us and just wants to know about the spiral and about the everything. So I hope you guys found that interesting. That was just like the kind of main story behind the Arc 4 so far, and I think it's very easy to miss a lot of this stuff that's kind of happening in the background, so I hope that was interesting. Now, why is this relevant and what is this? Well, I think Design and the nothing is supposed to serve as the main sparking force of Arc 4. He is the Malastair, Morgeth, and Grandfather Spider, but I don't necessarily know if he is evil. It doesn't seem like he's evil. It actually seems like he is definitively on our side, and while that may change, I don't think that that changes the fact that he is kind of the main character of Arc 4. Now, why this is important is I've said in the past, I don't feel like Arc 4 has a driving force, but again, that was before I kind of knew this lore. So this definitely added a lot to that. But let's now move into the section of the video where I think Arc 4 is going and where I think Arc 4 will kind of continue, because I did promise I would do that. So in terms of the story and what's next, I think that that's important to talk about. I think next we're going to kind of find Design, because Design, as I said, sacrificed himself, and we kind of saw him floating off in the background in the Arcanum. I have a feeling that that is related directly to the nothing and Design, and he will most definitely come back in the next world, in the third world, to further the plot again. It wouldn't surprise me at all, and I think that that's definitely the next step. Where exactly this is going, I don't know, but I have two main theories. I think either A, there is going to be a main villain that comes out of the whole world synthesizer plot. It is possible that they haven't directly introduced the main villain yet to the plot, and there is going to be a main villain that lasts the next 2 worlds or so. This wouldn't entirely surprise me, and I do think it's possible. I think Design is obviously going to come back, and they could potentially help us with this main threat and help us end it once and for all. Again, the nothing seems to be on our side. This wouldn't necessarily surprise me. Or B, Design going into this world synthesizer and kind of becoming becoming more with the whole Song of Creation and becoming more than the nothing, it is very, very possible that this changes design in some form of way. It's very possible that design becomes a villain from this, and maybe not necessarily an evil villain, but a villain nonetheless. Like, for example, Malistaire is not necessarily an evil villain. He does bad things, but he's not doing it for the sake of evil. He's doing it for the sake of his love. It wouldn't surprise me if we have another villain that is simply a villain for the sake of something greater. It's very possible that this is what's going to happen with Arc 4, so I think that those are the main two outcomes of this plot and what we're going to see with the next two worlds. I don't know exactly how it's going to be related, but it wouldn't surprise me if design is back and running within the next update and the next world. I think that's the most likely outcome. Now, what about the next few worlds? What are they going to look like, and what's the rest of Arc 4 going to look like? Well, first off, I do genuinely think Arc 4 is going to be 4 worlds. I've said this in the past, and I think that this is something that's very likely. In a forum post, I believe one of the devs said Arc 4 will not be necessarily restricted to 3 worlds or 5 worlds. It'll take as long as it needs to. I think that this is likely hinting at there being a 4-world arc. It may feel different, but I don't necessarily think it'll feel bad. Now, what will these worlds look like? That's an interesting question. Well, I do think it's possible that we visit a world that has just been kind of mentioned in the past. Like, there's been mentions of Darkmoor, obviously. I don't know if we've necessarily go to the world of Darkmoor, but you never know. Could be possible. It's also possible, you know, we go to something like Raja, something like that, where it's just a different world in of itself and a new interesting world. But what's it going to be thematically is the question. Now, looking at the worlds in the past, there tends to be a common theme. The first world is a bright and adventurous kind of optimistic kind of world, right? Like, you have Wizard City, you have Celestia, might not necessarily be optimistic, but it's definitely a brighter world compared to some of the other worlds in certain places. Let me amend that. In certain places, it's definitely darker, but in certain places, it's a little bit brighter. Then we have obviously Polaris, which is extremely bright and kind of has an optimistic vibe. And then finally Caramel, which I shouldn't have to describe. Those are the 4 kind of bright first optimistic worlds. And these second worlds, I've noticed, have always been a little bit more darker, a little bit more bland, but still tend to be a little bit rich in flavor. This is Krakatopia, Zafaria, Mirage, and Lemuria. All of these are actually pretty similar, I would say. They all have that same kind of vibe where it's a bit more bland, a little bit more dreary, but still really fits in with the story. Now, the third world's a little bit harder because obviously Arc 3 only has 3 worlds, so Imperia is the last world. Arc 2 has 5 worlds, so you can't really say Avalon. I would say that Chrysalis matches Imperia, obviously, and then Dragonspire for Arc 1, again, 5 worlds. I have a feeling that the 4th world in this Arc 4 4-world saga is probably going to have a dark and dreary aesthetic to match those. It's going to be an epic battle, something of serious kind of metal, and I definitely think that us being the Divine Paradox, being a mixture of shadow and light, is going to come into play here. I think that is going to be a major part of this arc, especially since the Nothing seems to take a lot of interest in that, and I think that that's what is going to be the main driving force behind the finale of this arc. As for the third world, it could really be anything. I don't think it'll be really fair to predict exactly what it is because it's going to be impossible to really do that. There's no real way. It could be anything from like a Marleybone type world to a Mushu type world to a Avalon type world to Azteca. We just don't know. It could be anything, any one of those worlds. Might be longer, might be shorter, might be bright, might be dark. It's hard to say, but I do genuinely think, you know, it'll be interesting. It'll be a stepping stone for the final world of this arc. But that's really it for today. That's really all I have to say and kind of a prediction of what Arc 4 is going to look like. Let me know, did you find this interesting? Did you like this kind of lore type video? I'm sure that there's some people who are actually very interested in it. I know that I was super interested when I read up on the Nothing and what the Nothing was up to. I didn't even know that design was the Nothing. I listened to the dialogue, which is funny, but it never really connected the dots, and nothing connected the dots that Aberrant Paradox was design. For some reason, that just didn't piece together in my head, but now that it pieced together, this is really cool, and Arc 4 suddenly became a lot cooler in my mind. So I really hope that in the future, they continue along with, you know, Arc 4 being really cool, and I hope that they use design to its true potential. But that's really it for today. Again, let me know what you think. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? What do you think about my predictions for the next worlds? What do you think the next worlds are going to look like? But that's it. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Adios.